and welcome back to the channel. My name is Muriel, and in this video I will be doing a review of Sherry S. Tepper's The Gate to Women's Country, which, as you can see, is available in the science fiction masterworks collection, as are Grass and Raising the Stones, written by the same author, both of which I have also read and reviewed for the channel. You can check that out if you want to. I was, however, introduced to Tepper's writing through The Gate to Women's Country, which I first read in 2018 as part of my literary foray into classic feminist science fiction. The Gate to Women's Country is indeed considered part of the feminist SFF canon, a story I loved upon first read-through, and which I cited as a favourite of science fiction in 2021. But, as with many other such works, it became increasingly clear I needed to reread it in order to feel more confident about the high rating I had given it. I'm happy to say it was well worth the reread, and I'm glad I now get to review it for you all. The Gate to Women's Country centres on a character named Stavia, a girl, then woman, born and raised in Women's Country, a matrifocal society that rose out of the ashes of a nuclear apocalypse, subtly referred to in the story as the convulsion on the North American continent, probably what used to be the United States. Women live in towns or small cities, the aforementioned Women's Country, carry out most of the activities one associates with civilization, so agriculture, crafts, industry, medicine, etc., and nominally hold all of the administrative and political power. Some men live among them, but most of the males born in Women's Country leave as boys at the age of 5 to grow up among the military garrisons posted outside of it and become soldiers, though their level of martial technology is limited. The men's garrisons are loosely modelled off of the martial cultures of the ancient Greco-Romans, and the ancient Greek satirical play, a fictional play I'm pretty sure, Iphigenia at Ilium, referenced numerous times throughout the story, serves as a narrative backdrop to expand and sustain a large part of the book's feminist theming. The Gate to Women's Country features two parallel timelines. The story opens up in the present, with our main character Stavia relinquishing the custody of her youngest son to the male garrison outside of her city. I think her city was called Marthatown, but I've already forgotten because, of course. This prompts her to start recollecting earlier parts of her life, and we then alternate between following younger Stavia through important parts of her life, and thus significant events in the history of Women's Country, and older Stavia as she confronts and integrates her past. With excerpts from Iphigenia at Ilium, the play she is rehearsing, periodically inserted in parallel to the main story. Now, I more or less went over my appraisal of Tepper's prose in my dual review for Grass and Raising the Stones, and will simply reiterate here that I find Tepper's style fairly limpid and elegant, neither too simple nor too complex. There's nothing about it that really sticks out to me, but it certainly manages to paint vivid pictures of the worlds she creates, and is effective enough to elicit emotion and provoke deep thought. The story is primarily told through Stavia's point of view, as the main female character, but it does also feature a main male point of view, as well as a couple of secondary ones here and there. Finally, whilst I was a little sad this time around to come to the end of the story and exit the thoughtful headspace it had put me in, its length just felt perfect to me. Bit of a random detail there, I know, but I really wanted to stress I felt this story was the exact length it needed to be, and that just, it felt good. I wouldn't say The Gate to Women's Country has the deepest character work ever, as I find it is more of an ideas-driven novel, but it was still good enough overall. Like I said, the narrative primarily centers on the female protagonist, named Stavia, and I decently liked her as a character. She is shown to be a thoughtful, dedicated, and rather mature child, then adolescent and young adult. Though this doesn't mean she is impervious to the trials and tribulations of puberty and teenage infatuation, as is also shown in the text. She was, in essence, the main character the story needed to carry its theming forward. And I would argue the same largely goes for the story's other main and secondary characters. All were realistic human characters. The goodies weren't saints, the baddies weren't pure evil. I'm putting it this way specifically because the novel explores gender, sex, and power dynamics between men and women, and does feature a partly matrifocal society, and I want to make it clear that the portrayal of both men and women is not at all stereotypical. The Gate to Women's Country is absolutely feminist literature, but it does not paint men wholesale as evil or women wholesale as virtuous. I mean, honestly, most of the feminist literature I've read, and enjoyed certainly, doesn't actually do this. But, you know, we live in a society, and thus I apparently, sadly, need to point this stuff out explicitly. So rest assured, the male and female characters here were fully realized human beings, and their interactions within and outside of Women's Country was satisfyingly multifaceted. As I stated in the synopsis, The Gate to Women's Country features a matrifocal society, a nation if you will, called Women's Country. This nation is made up of interrelated towns or small cities that are each protected, kind of, by all male military garrisons. This society arose after what must have been a nuclear cataclysm. Once again, it is never referred to as such, but large parts of the land are described as dead from radiation, so it's pretty obvious this was the result of an apocalyptic nuclear war of some sort. Plus, I mean, a lot of science fiction or post-apocalyptic stories from back in the day had nuclear warfare somewhere in their setup, so there's also that. Women's Country is partly sex segregated. Boys born to the women of the cities are given over to the male garrisons stationed outside of them at the age of 5, but they return to Women's Country for festivals and are then invited, even encouraged really, to renounce military and by proxy violent and hypermasculine life every year until their 15th birthday, when they can then decide to fully integrate garrison life. That being said, you also learn of men who leave garrison life even after that point. There are thus also men living in the cities of Women's Country, and they are called servitors. However, this name is a bit of a false flag, but I won't go into spoilers territory here. There is also mention of nomadic peoples, merchants, performers that travel between the cities of Women's Country but aren't technically part of its citizenry. All of this was portrayed very convincingly in the text, especially, given its moderate length. I mean, this is only about 300 pages long. Women's Country felt real, and as a partly matrifocal society seemed rather nice and appealing to me, I guess, as a woman in any case. But this had limits. All the female citizens of Women's Country are expected to develop expertise or proficiency in a science, an art, and a craft, which is an idea I really vibe with. But it's also a system that leaves little room for people who may only be specifically talented in one limited domain, and where personal freedom is somewhat constrained in service to the greater communal good. Stavia's sister, for instance, rebels against the rules and customs called ordinances of Women's Country, as she's not particularly intellectually or manually gifted, and only really wants to dance and make merry with men during the yearly seasonal festivals. As such, one could potentially argue Women's Country does weed out mediocrity, but at the same time, and as Stavia somewhat reflects upon, the sister isn't doing any harm either, and it takes all sorts of personalities to make up a community. Shouldn't Women's Country allow for a little flexibility there? It's a pretty egalitarian and communalistic society as well, but it isn't exactly democratic either. The leaders of Women's Country are chosen and are especially skilled, educated, and intelligent women, and by proxy some male servitors, sort of. Can't really say more than that. Most of whom are medically trained individuals. There's a reason for that. And they have access to knowledge that is purposefully held back from the rest of the population, again for reasons I'll touch upon in a later spoilers section. So is this a utopia? A dystopia? Both? Neither? I don't think there's a solid answer here, and that ties back into the theming I'll get to in a couple of minutes. But it's certainly not a perfect society, given its sex segregation. Though I guess there are technically some individuals who would see that as perfect, to each their own. Though, once again, there is a specific reason for this sex segregation, and it is also true boys are strongly encouraged to rejoin Women's Country as adults and male servitors. And I mean, the women of Women's Country don't like having to give up their sons when they turn 5 years old. They love their children and their brothers, etc. There are also a couple of, shall we say, troubling and, yes, outright problematic elements in the world building of Tepper's novel, which I'll go over now. They're not really spoilers as such. First, there's the fact girls are said to be educated about sexuality, sexual matters, sexual skills, and start having children at a relatively young age, or I mean what we would consider a relatively young age. Now, I find this troubling, rather than problematic stricto sensu, because Women's Country is, for one thing, absolutely matrifocal in that it does not have marriage as a social custom and does not force any of its female citizens to have sex with any specific man. Rape is not tolerated, and pre-pubertal children are absolutely not allowed to participate in the city festival's sanctioned sexual encounters. But I guess that, well, in a post-apocalyptic society where human survival is a greater concern than it is in ours, where a sense of social responsibility and maturity is strongly instilled in girls from a young age, and in a matrifocal one where men are never really able to exploit younger women in intimate relationships, though there are caveats to that, and said younger women have access to a very strong support network of peers and family, it does make sense that post-pubertal teenagers would truly be seen as young women and thus allowed to have children at 16, 17, 18, etc. Second, however, there is the legitimately problematic no homo element. Now, personally, I think a little too much is made of it on social media, as is everything generally, let's be real, as it is presented as something that negates any and all potential relevance and positive aspects of the gate to Women's Country. And, you know, same reasoning goes really for any work of second-wave feminist literature that doesn't pass the perfection test elaborated by contemporary standards. But the fact is that, whilst yes, it is regrettable, and yes, it does limit the thematic scope of the novel, this element ultimately pops up in all of one paragraph and is never brought up in the text again. Still, for transparency's sake, I'll read out the paragraph in question. Even in pre-convulsion times, it had been known that the so-called gay syndrome was caused by aberrant hormone levels during pregnancy. The women doctors now identified the condition as hormonal reproductive maladaptation and corrected it before birth. There are very few actual HNRMs, called henrams, either male or female, born in Women's Country, though there was still the occasional unsexed person or the omnisexed who would, so the instructors said, mate with a grasshopper if it would hold still long enough. If the warrior had indeed forced one of the boys, it had almost surely been done out of viciousness and dominance, not from any libidinal need. Libidinal need was fully accepted as a normal and useful fact of life. Viciousness was not. Rape wasn't tolerated in Women's Country. So here you have a, yes, pretty bad gene or hormone therapy the gay and the deviant away bit. A very feminist 101 sexual violence is more about dominance and sadism than it is about lust bit, and a rather positive, life-affirming sexuality is a healthy aspect of life for human beings bit. All in one paragraph. Now, I don't know what Tepper thought about homosexuality, and I don't care because of my personal position on authorial intent. I do think the reasoning behind the no homo bit in the novel makes some sense, given the context of a vulnerable post-apocalyptic population, though of course it doesn't mean I endorse it. Still, I can put it to the side. If this is a deal breaker for you in terms of picking up the book, I respect that, but for my part, I don't think this invalidates the rest of the novel. Overall, I found its world-building solidly engaging and a strong foundation for its very thoughtful theming, which I'll now delve into. There are, for me, three main thematic axes in The Gate to Women's Country, and as is often the case with fiction I find particularly intelligent and enjoyable, all are interconnected. The destructive cycle of violence and war is one, the price of civilization or the collective good is a second, sex, gender, and the long-lasting consequences of patriarchy or androcracy on human relationships and society is a third. That being, of course, the feminist stuff. There is quite a bit of commentary in The Gate to Women's Country about the ravages of violence and its most extreme form, war. The story is, after all, set after what is almost certain to have been a cataclysmic nuclear war, and several references to this convulsion, the violent ways of pre-convulsion and specifically male-led society, thus tying into the feminist theming, are made throughout the text. In fact, the anti-war and anti-violence theming is inextricably linked in this story to its analysis of the toxicity of masculinity, to put it simply, and patriarchal gender more broadly, which, by the way, includes traditional femininity as well. I mean, this is something lay people very much forget in feminist analysis. Femininity isn't good, it's also bad. Males who refuse to renounce violence and embrace more empathetic ways live out their lives in the loosely neoclassically marshaled garrisons, but even then, their ability to wage war and the military technology they have access to is very much kept limited. In all fairness, though, the limitation is also partly an inevitable consequence of, post-apocalyptic knowledge loss and stringent resource allocation. The citizens of Women's Country aspire to learn from the mistakes of their ancestors and progressively weed violent tendencies, or more specifically antisocial and dominating tendencies, the distinction matters here, out of the population. This ideal is further reinforced by the narrative parallel offered by the yearly performance of Iphigenia at Ilium, Women's Country's most culturally significant play, as it revolves around the female protagonists of the Trojan War and their experience of male pattern violence, the most extreme form of which, as I said earlier, is indeed armed conflict. The female leaders of Women's Country thus hope to create a better, more egalitarian, and peaceful world for everyone. Yes, everyone. Remember that boys, then adolescents, are strongly encouraged to rejoin Women's Country as they grow up and forego their integration of the male garrisons. The male citizens of Women's Country are called servitors, and the society of Women's Country is matrifocal, but matrifocal does not, in fact, mean matriarchal stricto sensu. To delve into feminist anthropology 101 for a hot minute, this is not a reversal of patriarchy, where men would presumably be oppressed by women through violence, exploitation of reproductive labor, and rigid gender norms. Women are the nominal leaders of Women's Country, yes. God, insofar as it is believed in by its citizens, is conceptualized as female, yes, and women, as guardians of life, if you will, are afforded a specific measure of respect, yes, but overall, the society of Women's Country aims to foster egalitarian, respectful, mutually enriching, and life-affirming bonds between men and women as individuals and civic partners. The means employed to achieve that aim, however, may seem counterintuitive, especially from an ethical standpoint, which I'll get back to in the spoilers section. Indeed, I don't think you're supposed to automatically conclude Women's Country is a utopia. It strives towards utopianism in a way, yes, and I don't personally think it's a dystopia either, but like I said, questionable shit happens in the story, and thus the conveyed history of Women's Country. I think the novel invites the reader to consider the price we have to pay as individuals to rebuild and maintain civilization and its benefits for the collective, even if said civilization seeks to improve upon what came before it. How far are we willing to sacrifice individual freedoms and impose individual responsibilities to ensure an ultimately better future? What means are we willing to employ to attain our idealistic ends. And if said means aren't entirely above board from a moral and or ethical standpoint, can they nonetheless justify the projected end of a more peaceful and somewhat utopian society? Yes, it's that age-old question, and I really enjoyed its subtly developed presence throughout the narrative. Like I said, the discussion of violence, war, and societal or civilizational reconstruction and reform is inseparable in The Gate to Women's Country from its examination of sex, gender, and androcratic power dynamics, or patriarchal power dynamics, done here through the lens of a society that has moved away, or is in the process of moving away, from said dynamics. Where does male-patterned violence and male domination come from? What is femininity? What is masculinity? How does society perpetuate all of these things, and how can it move beyond them? These fundamental questions lie at the heart of the story, and an attempt to provide answers drawing on, yes, radical, or classical as I would call it, but that's a matter of opinion of course, feminist theory, is made through Stavia's life journey and experience with the intricacies of her society. There is also, for the record, an adjacent examination of the differences between infatuation, teenage lust, and actual love, as romance is criticized several times in the text as a tool men, or I should say the warriors of the garrisons, employ to manipulate women into having sex with them and submitting to their abusive whims, within limits, because the women of women's country have, well, the protection of women's country. Conversely, it's also shown there is real friendship and, in my opinion, undoubtedly love, though it's not directly named as such, between women and their male servitors. And I thought this very delicate thread of theming was effective as well. Now, I'd like to specifically address something concerning the feminist theming or analysis of The Gate to Women's Country I've repeatedly seen criticized. Namely, that the second wave feminism that informs the novel, and thus presumably informed Tapper's own thinking, though once again I don't much care about intrinsic authorial intent here, is gender essentialist, i.e. that it posits masculinity and femininity as fixed and natural emergent properties of sex, and dichotomizes the former as evil and the latter as benign. I strongly disagree with this interpretation of the text, an adjacent interpretation of radical/second wave feminist theory as an aside. I think it's made pretty clear through the theming and character work that femininity and masculinity are, by and large, products of social upbringing and enforcement, and that men and women both can have prosocial, antisocial, empathetic, or aggressive traits. In fact, there are both male and female characters who directly warn Stavia against simplistic black and white thinking, even if, yes, there is also an unapologetic acknowledgement that males under patriarchy have been chiefly responsible for the most egregiously destructive ills of history and, most of sexual violence, violent crime, etc., etc. So I firmly stand by my opinion that the discussion of gender and sex-based oppression is very satisfyingly nuanced. Despite the stories, at first glance confusing, I'll admit, major plot twist regarding the societal restructuring project of the leaders of Women's Country, which I'll now get into. So I'm now going to discuss The Gate to Women's Country big plot twist, so major spoiler warning here, please skip to this timestamp for my concluding remarks, if you want to. You eventually learn in the novel that the leaders of Women's Country are working on a large-scale socio-genetic engineering scheme to get rid of aggressive and antisocial behavior in the male population. You can just call it a eugenic program for simplicity's sake if you want. Sure, I won't quibble too much over the usage of that specific term here. Most of the citizens of Women's Country believe that their children are born to the warriors of the garrisons they fool around with during festival time. And this is something it is imperative the latter believe as well, as their belief in paternity ensures their cooperation in the partly sex-segregated setup of Women's Country. But the truth is, all of the children born in Women's Country are actually fathered by the male servitors, and thus, pro-social and peace-choosing men through artificial insemination. And yes, this is done without the knowledge, much less consent, of almost all the women concerned. Only the female leaders of women's country and a few servitors respected for their wisdom and intelligence know what's up, and it is no coincidence that most of the former are doctors, directly involved in the reproductive healthcare of women's country's citizenry. The same women and servitors are also trained in martial arts, which they use for individual and societal self-defense when the male garrisons start developing, power-hungry ambitions to take over the cities of women's country. Violence is thus sanctioned under a very specific and limited set of circumstances, but still, ironically perhaps, in service to the goal of creating an ultimately pacifistic society. Some readers understand the eugenic element of the narrative as a theoretical endorsement of gender essentialism. To them, the text is saying that men are inherently violent as a sex class, it's in their genes, that some males are born with more peaceful traits, and this can thus be artificially selected for, so this is what women's country has decided to do. But I don't think that's the only conclusion you can draw from this plotline at all. Just because the leaders of women's country are selecting pro-social men, again to put it simply, to father their children, and may think this is genetically determined, I honestly can't say that was even stated outright in the text, doesn't mean you as the reader need to understand it that way. The selection can be understood to work on a purely or principally socio-environmental level. Now, additionally, there is a mildly parapsychological element in the narrative as well. It is observed that an increasing number of males are born with hyper-empathetic abilities, and that most, if not all, of said males will not stay in the garrisons, but reintegrate women's country as teenagers. But here's the thing, this ability is also shown to exist or emerge in females, so it's not a purely sex-linked trait. So what if women's country is simply selecting for pro-social and, broadly speaking, empathetic traits, standard or otherwise, on a purely psychological level? I mean, okay, fine, it would all ultimately kind of be rooted back in the body, because we're not just abstract minds, but hopefully you kind of all know what I mean here. Women are not all angels by default in the story, and there are women who leave women's country as they struggle to fit in. So if there are genetically transmissible psychological traits being favored, I don't think they need to be seen as sex-linked at all, or only marginally so. And that's very much not gender essentialist. It would only count as gender essentialist if you truly are 100% a blank slatist when it comes to behavioral sex differences. But actually, I'm not. I do think most of that stuff is a product of gender and androcratic socialization. I also believe it's possible some very minor differences, which would then have been amplified to an extreme degree over time by societies running on sexual inequality and sex-based oppression, exist between men and women as a result of sexual development. I really don't see this as a threat to my understanding of feminist analysis, my understanding of the world, and the relationship between personality, meat suit, and the fact we should treat people as individuals first, and sex body second, etc., etc. So there you go. As such, the theming and narrative outcome of The Gate to Women's Country really doesn't pose an issue for me as a gender critical or even, anti-gender feminist. However, the eugenic program endorsed by Women's Country definitely poses an issue in terms of ethics. Freaking duh! But this, of course, feeds back into the theming on the justification of the means to an end, and in that regard, I found it very well executed. As a quick little addendum, this plot thread reminded me a bit of research I came across, I can't remember when, done on a troop of wild baboons, I think it was. So the males in this troop of baboons were all very aggressive and domineering, but then something happened, a disease, I imagine, and the vast majority of them died in short succession. Sometime later, it was observed that the new generation of adult males, which had grown up without the presence and thus threat of the hyper-aggressive males, was significantly more peaceful and exhibited a lot more pro-social behavior towards the females and youngsters of the troop. I find the parallels here fascinating, and you know what, at the very least, it's a bit of food for thought. Always a good thing in my book. Yes, there are a couple of troubling to problematic elements in The Gate to Women's Country. The no homo thing is regrettable. I definitely agree with that. And beyond that, its world building is not perfect by any means. I would have liked to know, for instance, what would have been made of a woman who didn't want any children at all, like me, and would have also enjoyed a deeper delving into the relationships between the women of the cities and their servitors. Like I said, I got the feeling there was some genuine love-based relationships between the women and their servitors, but you know, I would have liked to see it fleshed out a bit, but, you know, that was simply not the focus of the story, and that's fine. But overall, this novel to me is a glorious example of proper and unapologetic feminist SFF literature, and I have immense respect for that. To be clear though, unapologetic does not mean indulges in soapboxing. This will of course depend on individual appreciation, as it always does, but I do not personally think the theming, feminist or otherwise, in The Gate to Women's Country counts as soapboxing at all. It is beautifully nuanced. More nuanced, in fact, than I remembered it being. I appreciated it all the more on this first reread, and also found it more emotionally impactful this time around. This novel dares to ask hard questions, and dares to explore potentially, yes, controversial answers, but without ever losing sight of fundamentally progressive and humanist values. Just like Le Guin's fiction or Octavia E. Butler's. Hell, I can throw Margaret Atwood into the mix just because of The Handmaid's Tale. Sherry S. Tapper, whilst not yet a favourite of mine like Le Guin is, definitely deserves to be considered a heavyweight of the feminist literary canon. And honestly, so be it if this is a hot or even spicy take, but I've so far been relatively unimpressed by most of the contemporary fiction I've encountered that calls itself feminist. Where has the good shit gone for real? I thus rated The Gate to Women's Country with a rock solid 8 out of 10 that could technically maybe be stretched upwards a little bit to an 8.5 out of 10. I would personally definitely recommend it, yes, though like I said, if the problematic elements I covered in my review are a deal breaker for you, fair enough. To each their own, as always. For my part, however, I would still, yes, consider this a soft science fiction and or post-apocalyptic favorites. And I now low-key regret taking it off my recently updated all-times favorite list. That's kind of silly, I know, but that's just the way it is. And that concludes my review of Sherry S. Tapper's The Gate to Women's Country. I hope you found this review interesting, informative, and or engaging, as always. If you want to share thoughts, feelings, what have you in the comments down below, you're more than welcome to do so. You are also welcome to join the channel's Discord server. There is a link for it in the description box. And on that very final note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all reasonably soon in the next video, but until then, bye-bye.